Okay, so here is the country, which is extremely important again.
Right. So, on the country, every country, including the United States, has its own unique issues, and it's not just what are the risk issues, but it's also, tell me about the economy.
Hmm.
You take a country like China, you could say, well, China's got a corruption issue. Well,
Yeah.
at one point they did, and I guess they always still do. Uh, but the big thing about China is, its role in the world economy.
Yeah.
Same for Bangladesh. What's the role of Bangladesh in the world economy? Every single country is that. And then what you have to do is say, okay, in that country, are there, number one, what kind of stuff should I expect with that country? But number two, is there any areas that I should have heightened concerns about? And so you want to get all of that organized, and you want to get it all uh, dealt with in the relationship memo. So if I'm dealing with a relationship memo, and I'm looking at maybe a customer that's in China, I might say, okay, tell me, kind of, how they're dealing with corruption, or how they're dealing with sanctions evasion, or transnational crime. And we would use this format, to have our underwriting group say, well, this is how this particular customer deals with their, country risk. And like I said earlier, we'd rather have a framework that forces everybody, whether it's the people preparing the memos or the decision makers, to deal explicitly with the problem. The last thing we want is people kind of bearing the problem or drafting around it, that sort of thing. And then, most importantly, if the compliance calls go well, or the activity reviews that lead up to the compliance calls, we want to know, kind of what the role of the respondent bank is in controlling that country risk. And so, a lot of times what we'll see is portions of the compliance calls saying, yeah, they're in Mexico. They know that drug cartels are a problem, and this is how they deal with drug cartels in Mexico. You know,
Yeah.
Maybe kind of difficult to write that or to have that initial conversation, but it makes for much more meaningful decisions. And what I will say from personal experience is, while the first conversation, may be a little startling that you brought it up, after you do it year after year, you're all on the same page and you're all trying to solve a mutual problem. So, a lot of that awkwardness just absolutely goes away. And you're talking about success stories. Hey, let me tell you
Exactly.
about that drug cartel I found. Can you imagine that they did this? And, good thing we
Yeah.
caught it.
Such a great way of getting the information. I think this is absolutely great. And and Tom, I would also like to know from you that when an organization is writing a country report, right? Some of the things that they're covering already. What are the other resources that they can, refer to, like, different reports by international organizations and all that, and how should they read those reports?
Okay, so I had the country report team report to me, so I helped design that, and then they you know were operating under my direction, and we had to design it from scratch. And what we decided was, number one, we wanted to capture uh, kind of what we knew about the country, but what we knew about the country from an actionable perspective. So, you had certain things, whether it's NGO reports or whatever, that, very much informed the world's view about that country. You had mentioned Transparency International. The U.S. has some agencies that, would have some things. Obviously, you have FATF, uh, that would have, very, very definite views on the country and all sorts of reports and whatever. So, we would go through those, but we would be presenting them from the perspective of a correspondent bank. And, like on the FATF stuff, there were certain areas of FATF that were much more important to me than others. For example, I would want to know what are the rules for underwriting beneficial ownership. Maybe I'd be a little bit less concerned about, how well is their FIU, dealing with an FIU in a different country, although that's not always the case. In tax evasion, the intergovernment cooperation would be really important. But you would certainly try to capture that from a framework perspective. The other thing that we did was we wanted to know kind of what sort of cases were hitting the major media around the world, and we had to find a sweet spot between kind of your I mean, if you had no limitation on what you did, then you're getting into a data dump, and the last thing I wanted was a data dump. So what I said is, look, focus on the major global papers, particularly here in the U.S. So it could be things like Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Financial Times, Bloomberg, those type of things, and search those. Periodical or sources, for that country and certain typologies like corruption or sanctions or drug cartels or whatever, so that we know which major cases, are hitting the press. And then, maybe the major papers in the region or in the country. But we didn't want to get down into the heavily biased press or blogs or things like that, unless it was starting to get picked up by the major papers. And
Right.
there was two reasons for it. One was it very much, I think, helped define the quality of information that
Yes.
we were looking at as far as actionability. But the second thing is, one of the things you're concerned about is reputation risk. And
Mm.
so if it's hitting those type of periodicals, it's much more likely that you're going to have reputation risk and that you're expected to know that. And then the other thing is we would very much pick up what we were getting from our activity reviews and from our compliance calls. So in almost all instances, we would have multiple customers, in a particular country, and we'd be using those activity reviews and those compliance calls to set a baseline. And I would expect the people on my team that were in the underwriting to be feeding information to the country report team, who were their peers, about what we're learning. And so it's like,
Right.
this is what we're learning from our customers as far as what's happening in their markets. So a really good country report is really picking up not only what we're seeing, at the NGO level or the newspaper level, but what we're hearing from the banking sector itself.
Exactly. And I think that, my observation is that a good country report must include, their interpretation. I mean, whoever is doing it, whoever is preparing it, instead of just, picking up information from the public domain. Because I think at the end of the day, the conclusion or the interpretation, the diversified interpretation is very important, especially when you're operating from a different country. And the other point I wanted to share and also get your feedback on that is the concentration risk, particularly on ownership. So I think that, many country reports do include the concentration risk. For example, if a financial sector of a country has any concentration risk on a particular industry, and real estate or, infrastructure or some of the, sectors where things can go bad easily. What are your thoughts on those?
Well, I agree with everything that you're saying. So as far as having a point of view, I know that our head of international very much was very vocal about, he wanted his risk people to have a point of view, not just simply, abstractly saying, well, on the one hand, there's this, on the other hand, there's that. He said, I may very well disagree with your point of view, and if I do, I'll tell you that. But he says, I want you to have a point of view. But the second thing is, for me, particularly with doing all the travel and the compliance calls and the approvals, I very much did have a point of view, but whether I wanted to
Yes.
or not, I just was in a role that I did. And since the country report team also reported up to me, and I was seeing their work product, if not the actual country report, which oftentimes I would see, but certainly the summary of the country reports and the relationship memo, I was a natural overlapping point where the point of view would come in. And ironically, uh, there was times that I thought that maybe the media or the NGO stuff was more of a lagging indicator, and that what we were hearing from our banks, was much more useful, particularly on the mitigation.
Mm.
So if I was seeing things like, well, that may have been true 3 years ago, but they're very much dealing with the issue and they've changed their regulations and X, Y, and Z. I'd have them go back to the compliance calls, or maybe I'd help them find it, and say, look, make sure that we include this, because I was a consumer of both. I was the consumer of the country reports. I was the consumer of the relationship memos and the compliance calls, and quite frankly, I guess I had a stake in preparing them. So,
Yeah,
as far as a point of view, to some extent, it was me and the people that worked for me, would provide that.
sure.
And then, what was the other issue that you
The
brought
other,
up?
yeah, the other point was on concentration risk. So, do you think that a country report should include if there are any concentration risk in that country in terms of heavily dependent on particular industries?
Yes,
Uh,
yes,
mhm.
absolutely. Because if you have that concentration risk, and every country actually has that. I mean, every country has got its own,
Yeah,
type of issues or whatever. So you're going to have that. It's really important not only for the relationship memo, but for all of the other stakeholders. So if I have people in the first line of defense or the second line of defense that are reviewing activity, the expectation is they're going to be looking at the country report to understand, how they should be viewing that. So it's also kind of a way of evangelizing kind of what sort of criteria they should use, and what it should look like.
exactly.
And
Right.
sometimes there's, obviously every country has its own risk.
Yeah, that's
You
true.
better be outlining those risks and saying, look, if you see X, Y, and Z, escalate it right away.
Yeah, great. Thanks.